Yes, hi, welcome everybody. It is my pleasure to introduce Giulia Cabbai as today's Consciousness Club speaker. Giulia did her PhD at Sussex University together with Jamie Ward and Sophie Foster on voluntary and involuntary imagery in aphantasia. This is what she's going to talk to us about today. She then went on to do a postdoc also with Sophie Foster on involuntary thought intrusions. And after that, I am very, very pleased to say that she joined my lab here at UCL, and she's going to study the role of voluntary and involuntary imagery in perceptual reality monitoring. It's been a real pleasure to work with Giulia, and I'm really excited to have her present in Consciousness Club today. So take it away, Giulia.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. And in general, thank you so much for inviting me to give a talk at the Consciousness Club. I'm really excited to present today the work that I've been carrying out on mental imagery since my PhD. And as the title indicates, today we will present a series of studies that led to investigating the neural basis of conscious imagery experience. So to give you a brief overview, I will first introduce an influential definition of mental imagery, which includes two main components, a conscious experience and a sensory representation. And from there, I will then explain individual differences in conscious imagery variation, and then how they raise questions on the relationship between these two postulated components. Next, I will address methodological challenges in studying this variation, focusing on a first project in which we examine the impact of demand characteristics arising from direct recruitment of aphantasics. Following that, I will present a second project in which we found behavioral evidence for preserved visual template function in aphantasics. And then I will introduce involuntary imagery, highlighting its potential significance in understanding the neural correlates of conscious imagery. And I will describe a final project in which we employed this type of imagery in a paradigm together with voluntary imagery, and we found sensory representation in primary visual cortex are not sufficient for conscious imagery. And I will end on some proposed mechanisms and future directions. Okay, so if I ask you to imagine a beautiful place that you've been to, for instance, a beautiful beach, the experience that most of us would have would be of an image with colors, elements, shapes in space, in spite of the actual place being not there in front of us. And so, first of all, we can define mental imagery as a conscious, subjective experience. And this definition of imagery as a conscious experience has very deep historical roots. From the ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle to Hume to William James, we can see how across ages imagery has been considered as inherently conscious. And not only that, but these people thought that mental images constitute the basic block of consciousness. And then from the cognitive revolution in the 70s, scientists also started to consider mental images are more kind of representation akin to perception and embedded in a sensory processing system, the brain. And the current influential definitions of imagery involve both of these components. So using the word of Koslin and colleagues, imagery is when a representation is present, but the stimulus is not actually being perceived. Such representations preserve the properties of the stimulus and give rise to the subjective experience of perception. Another influential definition by Joel Pearson and colleagues, we use the term mental imagery to refer to representations and the accompanying experience of sensory information without a direct external stimulus. And so while initial measures of imagery were mostly only subjective after the cognitive revolution and especially with the advent of neuroimaging in the 90s, the focus of investigation shifted progressively on the sensory representation component. And in particular, scientists wanted to demonstrate whether imagery representations were indeed perceptual, sensory in nature. So they focused on investigating whether the same region which is involved in perception, for instance, in the case of visual imagery, the early visual cortex, was also involved in imagery. And there are some mixed evidence for those fMRI studies, for instance, that just look at the increase in bold activation of visual cortex during imagery compared to some baseline. But studies that later employed more advanced and sensitive approaches, such as MVPA and decoding, were capable of showing overlapping representation for imagined and perceived stimuli, to the point that even low-level visual features of imagery could be decoded as early as the primary visual cortex. And this led to the conceptualization of the vision in reverse model by Joel Pearson, whereby the early visual cortex represents the endpoint where conscious imagery is thought to be generated. And while these studies are really great in showing us that, providing us evidence for this sensory representation component, unfortunately, the vast majority of them did not measure the accompanying conscious experience of imagery. So the precise relationship between the two postulated components of imagery remains unclear. So in other words, a guiding question that I had during my PhD was, is this conscious experience of imagery always the consequence of a sensory representation in visual cortex, or are these two components potentially dissociable? And while I was really motivated, and this question was like really important for me, even more importantly, considering that there is a great variation in the population in the ability to experience conscious imagery. And this conscious experience does not only vary between individuals, but even within individuals themselves. So the experience of imagery can vary from moment to moment. And when I talk about conscious experience of imagery, the way in which in the field we measure it typically is in terms of vividness, which is the clarity and intensity of the experience. And vividness is usually assessed using some subjective measures, such as questionnaires, like the very infamous vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, in which participants are asked to read a series of scenarios and generate a visual mental image corresponding to that scenario, and then rate the vividness, so the intensity of their mental image, on a scale from 1 being no image at all to 5 being a very vivid mental image. And so in this way, nowadays, we know that when some people in the population are asked to generate, for instance, a visual mental image of an apple, they can do so fairly vividly. And some of them even to the point that the apple feels as real as actual perception. So this group of people that can generate mental images at will represents the vast majority of the population, and it's called as visualizers. But in 2015, there's been this formal discovery by Adam Zeman of a small percentage of the population that, when asked to generate a visual mental image of an apple, reports either being completely unable to do so or only generate a very vague and dim mental image. And these are called, these have been called aphantasics. And since the formal discovery in 2015, there's been an explosion in the field in the investigation of this group, because they represent a very intriguing population. First of all, because despite the lack of imagery experience, aphantasics do not show any corresponding deficit in visual perception. And second, for me, they represented a very interesting group in that, in my view, they could allow to test the relationship between the two postulated components. So a question that I had is, do aphantasics lack the conscious imagery? Do they lack the conscious imagery experience because, as per imagery definition, they also lack the sensory representation in visual cortex? Or is it possible that they lack the experience but still have this preserved sensory representation, which allows them to function in daily life? And I was really interested in addressing this question, but during my PhD, I realized soon enough that it was not at all easy or straightforward to address this question. And so the first challenge that I encountered and that I want to talk to you about is this challenge of recruitment and demand characteristics. So to illustrate it to you, an issue is that the prevalence of aphantasics in the population is very low. So we're talking about 4% of the population. And this makes aphantasics recruitment extremely difficult and challenging. So a common approach that researchers in the field use, including myself, is to directly recruiting self-reported aphantasics, but by advertising the study on aphantasia Facebook or Reddit groups, or even sending a direct email invitation to aphantasia database, or self-referral of self-reported aphantasics to the researcher. And while this is a great way to override the issue of a very low prevalence of this group, in other special populations, this has been shown and discussed as a potential problem. Why? Because direct recruitment of a special population, for instance, this has been discussed in synesthetes. So direct recruiting synesthetes to do a study in light of the fact that they are synesthetes can lead to this population to generate expectation on the study goals. In other words, increasing demand characteristics and potentially affecting these group responses. So what I wanted to understand is, can this direct recruitment approach that is employed with aphantasics potentially lead to affect the responses? And so I investigated that in the first project that I will present to you today, which is a study in which we wanted to originally investigate the link between a trait called phenomenological control and the ability to generate visual mental imagery at will. So by either controlling for demand characteristics or testing the impact on responses, on the association between these two things. So to give you a little bit of context, phenomenological control is this trait ability that has been typically investigated in hypnosis using an hypnotic induction in which after this hypnotic induction, participants are asked to generate and alter their experience in response to some kind of suggestions, such as perceiving something imagined as real, voluntary movement as involuntary. But these kind of experiences do not necessarily arise as a consequence of hypnotic context, but can also arise outside it. And so in the field of hypnosis, imagery has been considered to play a key role in generating responses to suggestions. But the evidence is very mixed, and it's often confounded by context effects, which represent a kind of variation of demand characteristics. They specifically refer to these reactive effects of measurements that are made in the same experimental situation. So in other words, when scales of imaginative suggestibility are collected alongside other self-report measures, correlations tend to be high and much higher compared to when they are measured in separate contexts. And so what we first investigated in a first study is whether phenomenological control was associated with the ability to generate voluntary mental imagery when controlling for these context effects. And we also wanted to understand whether imagery is necessary for responding to this suggestion by looking specifically at aphantasics. And then in a second study, we wanted to test what is the impact of recruitment strategies in aphantasics responses. So the way in which we controlled for context effects in study one was following this single blind recruitment approach, in which to a large sample of participants, more than 500 participants, we administered, as part of a completely separate study, I administered the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire to get a measure of trait imagery abilities. And my colleagues, Peter Lash, administered the phenomenological control scale to assess these phenomenological control abilities, but as part of completely separate studies. And in this way, participants wouldn't know that we wanted to relate the two measures together. So in this sense, it was a blind recruitment. And then the way in which I assessed aphantasics and visualizers was by relying on the scores on the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire. So in the field, aphantasics are defined usually by a specific range and visualizers as anything above that range. And so the results of this first study, in which we followed this single blind recruitment approach, as you can see on the plot on the left, the phenomenological control scale here is plotted on the y-axis against the VBIQ. And as you can see that there is a small relationship between these two traits, which is positive. So we could say that the imagery does make a small contribution to responses to imaginative suggestion, but as you can see, the correlation is quite low, it's quite small. So it's just a very limited contribution. It's not the main driving factor. And then when separating our sample into non-aphantasics, namely visualizers, and aphantasics, as you can see here, aphantasics are only slightly lower, they're significantly lower, but they're only slightly lower. We're talking about a third of a point difference on a 6-point scale than non-aphantasics. And importantly for me, as you can see here, the scores has quite a range, which means, and it's well above 0, which would denote no experience generated following these imaginative suggestions. So in other words, we can say that aphantasics that are recruited following this blind recruitment approach can still generate experiences in response to imaginative suggestions that are perceived as involuntary. But then in study 2, things get quite interesting. So here, we recruited a further sample of aphantasics, but following this direct recruitment approach by sending out invitation to aphantasics who know their aphantasics to an aphantasia database. And so, as you can see, the self-reported aphantasics shown on the right, their scores on the phonological control scale is very low, and it's not only lower than non-aphantasics, which would be expected, but it's also much lower than blinded aphantasics. We're talking about more than a point difference. And a lot of scores of this group are at floor. So unfortunately, what this suggests is that, like any other special populations, direct recruitment of aphantasics can lead to form expectations on the study goal and affect responses. And I realized that this result makes it also particularly problematic for testing aphantasics in the classic way in which we test them in the field, by relying on voluntary imagery. Because by definition, when people are recruited to do a voluntary imagery task, they know that the task is about imagery. So we're basically recruiting a group that knows their aphantasics to do something that they know they cannot do in the first place. And this risk in raising the demand characteristics, so with participants not fully engaging with the task or doing something different. So how can we address this issue? Well, first of all, we can follow the blind recruitment approach, which would be ideal. But unfortunately, as I said before, the prevalence of aphantasics is extremely low in the population. So this makes the use of this option extremely challenging and time-consuming, and especially for in-person studies. So an alternative approach that we can follow is employing tasks that involve the automatic generation of sensory representation / conscious imagery. So in which aphantasics do a task that lead them to automatically generate this sensory representation, so implement them outside of their awareness. And this is indeed the approach that I followed for the next 2 studies that I will present to you. So in the first study, I wanted to specifically test whether aphantasics show preserved performance in tasks requiring the automatic generation of sensory representation. In other words, can we find preserved behavioral performance in these kind of tasks? Sorry, 1 second. So in the second project that I will present to you today, we specifically tested the link between, we addressed this question by testing the link between conscious imagery variation and automatic visual template operation. We use a paradigm that induces contingent capture, which is this well-studied effect in the attention literature, characterized by an unintentional shift of spatial attention towards target-defining feature in the environment. To give you a practical example, so if you look into this image, imagine you're searching for a friend wearing a red scarf. So when you're searching for a target item in the environment, irrelevant items that possess some of the target diagnostic feature, so in this case, the red color, such as one of the red signs here, are more likely to capture your attention than items that do not possess that visual features. So this is what is known as contingent capture. And what made it extremely interesting for me is the fact that this effect is thought to be caused by the automatic implementation of visual attentional templates representing target-specific visual features. And in the past years, there's been indeed quite a lot of interest for the relationship between imagery and attentional templates as both are considered as sensory representation that involve similar neural mechanisms. In fact, there is a study that's showing that also attentional templates can be decoded in the early visual cortex, much like imagery. And attentional templates are indeed considered to represent either an image of the target or visual features of the target, such as the target color. And so in this study, in this project, the main question we wanted to address is this automatic generation of attentional templates and the impact on attention affected by an individual's self-reported ability to generate imagery at will? So the paradigm that we used to address this question was as follows. So here I'm showing you an example trial of the task that we employed. So in each trial, participants were asked to look for a target object, which was specified at the beginning of the trial, such as via a word, such as lemon. And this target object would then appear among other distractors, all of them characterized by a specific color. And this was done to encourage participants to generate a target representing the color feature. And then the main task would be to judge the orientation of a line appearing on top of the target object. But crucially, immediately prior to this target display, a queue display would be briefly flashed. And this queue display was constituted by several colored dots that were surrounding one of the 4 potential target locations. And one of the colored dots was set to match with the target color, which is, in this case, is yellow for lemon. And so the idea is that when the queue was trial, when the colored dots matching the target were presented at the same position in which the target would then be shown. Whereas a trial would be invalid when this colored queue would be presented in a different position. The idea is that when you're looking for a lemon and you're generating this visual template for color, that will lead your attention to be captured by the cue that are specifically representing that visual feature, such as yellow, shifting your attention away from the target when it's presented at an invalid position, and making you slower in responding. And that's how we indexed contingent capture, which reflects a difference in reaction times between invalid and valid trials. And so we investigated across 3 different studies the link between this contingent capture effect and imagery. In the first study in particular, we measured VVIQ, the ability to generate imagery voluntarily, and we wanted to test whether this was related to the magnitude of the contingent capture effect. Importantly, because we wanted participants to generate any template spontaneously or any associated visual imagery spontaneously in this task, we never mentioned imagery at all before they did the actual task. We only measured the VVQ at the very end. But in a second study, we actually used a different approach, because here in study 2, we asked explicitly participants to generate a visual mental image of the target object on each trial, and also rate the imagery vividness at the end of each trial, with the idea that we wanted to see whether we could find a relationship between contingent capture and a more fine-grained and task-specific measure of imagery vividness. And our final study, which is study 3, in this study, we wanted to test aphantasics, as our idea is that if we can find a preserved contingent capture effect in aphantasics, this would provide the strongest evidence of a dissociation between attentional visual templates function and imagery abilities. Okay, so looking at study 1 and study 2 results. So as you can see on the plot here on the right, so on the left, reaction times are shown on the y-axis as a function of valid and invalid trials, and the color of the lines represent the specific study. So study 1 is the blue line, is when participants did not receive any explicit imagery instruction, and study 2 is when we instead invited them to generate a target, a visual mental image of the target object. In both studies, we find a significant contingent capture effect by the color cue, which is reflected by them being slower in responding during invalid trials. But crucially, as you can see, the magnitude of the contingent capture effect does not differ between the 2 studies. So it does not vary depending on the imagery instruction. And crucially, looking at our main question is there a relationship between the magnitude of this effect and imagery abilities? So as you can see on these plots, we did not find any significant relationship between the magnitude of the contingent capture effect and either the VVIQ in study 1 or the trial-based state vividness ratings in study 2. So what does this mean? This means that in these studies, involuntary attentional template operation is unrelated to the ability to generate imagery voluntarily in these samples. But then the results are even more striking in study 3, which is the study in which we collected 91 ephantasics to do this task. Importantly, ephantasics did the same paradigm as study 2, so we didn't cue them to imaging, and we didn't tell them they needed imagery to complete the task. And as you can see, very strikingly, the magnitude of the contingent capture effect is nearly identical between ephantasics and visualizers. In other words, ephantasics were captured by the color cue matching the visual template as much as visualizers. But in this study, we also ask our participants to report to the subjective strategies that they use to find the target object. And so aphantasic strategies mostly involved repeating the name of the target object in their head or sub-vocalizing it, or in some cases quite interesting for me, ephantasics reported having some kind of insight, a feeling of where the correct target would appear, but they couldn't describe how they found it. And these ephantasic strategies were completely different than visualizers, strategies which mostly relied on thinking about the target color or even picturing the target in some cases, so relying on mental imagery. So quite different subjective experience in spite of the same behavioral effect. So what we can conclude from this study is that aphantasics can generate and use sensory representations in terms of visual template, but without any associated conscious imagery experience. And this result for me is very interesting as it aligns with other studies in the field that look into ephantasics and that administered behavioral tasks in which the aphantasics were required to generate a sensory representation, but without explicitly instructing them to generate voluntary imagery. For instance, visual working memory task, mental rotation task. So this study found the same performance in aphantasics and in visualizers, but in those studies in which also ask about strategies or subjective reports. So the subjective reports are always different between the two groups. And an interesting opinion paper by Michel and colleagues have recently discussed these results, suggesting that perhaps it is not that aphantasics lack the ability to do these tasks in the first place, so they don't lack these imagistic abilities, but what they lack is awareness over their imagistic abilities. So they propose aphantasia as a potential imagery blind site. And this is all very interesting. However, there are still some open questions. So first of all, these behavioral results could be explained by alternative mechanisms supporting different strategies, or the subjective reports provided during these studies could be affected by demand characteristics arising from direct recruitment, as I explained to you earlier. So what we still don't know is there actually this sensory representation generated in aphantasics brain? We still don't know that. And second, what we also don't know yet is it that aphantasia reflects specifically an inability to generate this sensory representation in the first place, or is it more about an inability to consciously experiencing the associated imagery experience, or both? So in other words, we haven't yet addressed the question that I told you at the beginning of the talk, which is this conscious experience of imagery always the consequence of a sensory representation, or are these two components dissociable? And what I realize is that we cannot simply answer this question and look into this dissociation by just relying on voluntary imagery. First of all, because voluntary imagery requires an extra step beyond just experiencing imagery, namely the ability to generate it on demand. And conscious imagery variation is typically assessed using the vividness of visual imagery questionnaire, which by definition only measures the ability to generate imagery voluntarily. So what we know is that aphantasics lack the self-reported ability to generate and consciously experience voluntary imagery, but we don't know if, for instance, they would be able to experience imagery if triggered involuntarily. And finally, when asked to generate imagery, aphantasics might be doing something different, and this again is related to the issue of demand characteristics. And so we need to test, in order to address this dissociation, involuntary imagery. So we need to test involuntary imagery to disentangle the issue of generation on demand from the issue of conscious experience. And so when I told you the word involuntary imagery, what you might have thought about is something negative and linked to clinical condition. And this makes complete sense because that's where this kind of imagery has been typically investigated, namely in the clinical field. So we know in clinical condition that these involuntary mental images can range from, for instance, having distorted view of oneself, which is typical of eating disorders, or imagining one's own cravings in people with substance dependencies, or traumatic re-experiencing traumatic memories as intrusive mental images in people with PTSD or depression. And so we know that involuntary imagery plays a crucial role in this. But involuntary imagery does not necessarily have a negative connotation, and it does not necessarily arise only in clinical condition. In fact, involuntary imagery can also occur in daily life. So what I want to ask you now is to listen carefully to the sound that I'm going to play to you. And I hope you can listen to it. Sorry about that. So as soon as I play the sound, some of you might have experienced an associated visual mental image triggered by the sound, such seagulls, for instance, very typical sound of Brighton. And so this kind of multimodal, defined by Nane as multimodal or associative imagery defined by Joel Pearson, is very common in our daily life. I can make you countless examples. Another example is, imagine you're walking by a fresh bakery and there is this smell of fresh bread being baked. And that smell alone can trigger an associated visual mental image of the baked goods. So the idea is that it's imagery, visual mental imagery, that is triggered by stimuli in other sensory modality. But it doesn't have to be triggered just in this way. Involuntary imagery can also arise when we are reading, for instance, triggered by the text. Or sometimes the origins of involuntary imagery are a bit unclear. So coming back to the auditory modality, earworms for me are an extremely interesting case, which is this type of involuntary auditory imagery characterized by catchy tunes that get stuck in your brain and you just cannot get rid of them. And this interesting study by Lee Cannon and colleagues found that in a sample of over 12,000 people, they found that 90% of participants reported experiencing this type of involuntary imagery at least once per week, which is striking. And also in my case, in a study with a smaller sample, but still more than 100 participants. So in this study that we are currently writing up, we sampled participants' experience, participants' thoughts several times over a day and during a week, because we wanted to understand how much imagery occurs in daily life and specifically involuntary and voluntary imagery. And crucially, although the specific percentage of occurrences of involuntary and voluntary imagery spread across all thoughts over a week were around 23% for involuntary and 30% for involuntary imagery, crucially, all our participants reported experiencing involuntary imagery during the week. So we have seen that involuntary imagery can occur in our daily life and can be quite pervasive, but then how can we actually investigate it? So by definition, this type of imagery is particularly difficult to control and manipulate in experimental settings. So a study that was very inspiring for me doing my PhD is this study by Vetter and colleagues, which interestingly is not a study about mental imagery. It's a study about non-retinal input to the visual cortex. So what the author did was placing their participants in the scanner blindfolded, and they would then play to participants a series of sounds, such as the sound of forest, people, or traffic, intervealed by silence. And what they found was that not only they were able to decode in the brain of participants, in the auditory cortex, which sound category participants were listening to, but crucially and super interestingly, they were also able to decode the sound categories from participants' early auditory cortex. So when I saw this study, I was so happy because I thought, okay, could it be that participants are generating spontaneous subjective imagery in response to the sound? And unfortunately, we cannot know that because this was not a study about imagery, so the authors did not ask the participants whether they were experiencing spontaneous imagery in response to the sound. But nevertheless, I consider that perhaps sounds could be a good way to trigger and study involuntary imagery in the scanner. And so what I did in the third project that I will present to you today, which is an fMRI study. So I selected, first of all, I wanted to select sounds that would be effective in inducing a spontaneous imagery in the scanner. So I did a series of pilots in which I selected sounds based on vividness, and then the final sound selected would be separated into 6 categories, and each category would have 3 exemplars of that specific sound. For instance, we had 3 exemplars of sound of cat, 3 exemplars of sound of dog, and so on. And so I then recruited 26 visualizers, 24 aphantasics, placed them in the scanner, and then the main task in the scanner was as follows. So there were 2 main task participants had to do, and the first part of scanning, which we call the passive listening task, this was the part that was designed to induce involuntary imagery. So crucially, before this task, participants didn't know the study was about imagery. We never mentioned the word imagery to them. We didn't instruct them to generate any mental image. The only instructions we gave to our participants before they commenced this part was simply to carefully listen to the sounds that would be played to them. Okay, so then we played our natural sounds interviewed by silence for 5 different runs. And only at the very end of this passive listening task, we asked them a surprise question, asking them, did you experience any spontaneous imagery automatically triggered by the sounds during the first part? And then they could rate the imagery vividness. Then the second main task that participants had to do in the scanner was this voluntary imagery task. Okay, and the structure of the rounds, of the 5 rounds of this voluntary imagery task was identical to the first part, except in this case, participants received the explicit instruction to generate voluntary visual mental images of the sound content while they were listening to the sounds. And then we also separately collected voluntary imagery vividness ratings of the sounds. And so with this paradigm, the main questions that we wanted to address is, first of all, can we find spared sensory representation in aphantasics that are internally generated? And does this depend on how these sensory representations are generated? So can we only find them when triggered involuntarily, or can we find them also when triggered voluntarily? And to address this question, we employed MVPA, specifically we used decoding, to test whether we could decode the sound content in the primary visual cortex, doing both tasks, so the spontaneous imagery and voluntary imagery, and in both groups, aphantasics and visualizers. But then our second main question is, okay, but then if we find preserved sensory representation and no difference between the 2 groups, aphantasics and visualizers, do then differences arise in higher level regions that could be involved in conscious awareness of internally generated sensory representations? And so we then, to address this question, we targeted the precuneus a higher level region that has been implicated in awareness of internal representation, such as autobiographical memory, dreams, mind wandering, and so on. So to go straight into the results, let's first take a look at our conscious subjective imagery results provided during scanning. So here, aphantasics are represented by the green line and visualizers by the purple line. So as you can see, these are vividness ratings for each task, passive listening, which is our involuntary imagery condition, and voluntary imagery. So aphantasics ratings are very much in line with expectation. They reported to never experience imagery during scanning, whereas, as you can see, visualizers are not only higher than aphantasics in terms of vividness ratings, but interestingly, as you can see, our sounds were effective in inducing subjective imagery in visualizers, even during the passive listening task, in which they were not told to imagine beforehand. But then things get quite interesting when looking into the primary visual cortex. So here I'm showing you on the y-axis the coding accuracy again as a function of task, and this is the chance level. So crucially, as you can see, during passive listening, our spontaneous imagery condition, we found decodable sensory representation in aphantasics in stark contrast with the absence of subjective experience during the same condition. And the decoding accuracy here is not different than visualizers, for whom instead the coding accuracy increases when they're explicitly told to imagine. Whereas for aphantasics, when they cue to generate voluntary imagery, the coding accuracy dramatically decreases. And now it is at chance level. And interestingly also, in our visualizer participants, we found that the strength of sensory representation in the primary visual cortex, in terms of decoding accuracy, was positively correlated with the subjective experience for the corresponding conditions, so spontaneous and voluntary imagery, suggesting the information decoded was indeed associated to conscious experience in this group. And finally, in Percunus, our higher level region, as you can see here, the pattern of results mirrors more closely the subjective imagery results, in that aphantasics decoding accuracy is at chance level for both tasks, passive listening and voluntary imagery, and whereas visualizers were not only significantly higher than aphantasics, but the decoding was significantly above chance level in both conditions, with no difference between the two tasks. And so what does this all mean? Well, we can see how in our aphantasics participants during the spontaneous imagery condition, we found decodable representation in V1 in absence of the subjective imagery. And so this supports a dissociation between the sensory representation and the subjective experience. But then in voluntary imagery, we actually found no decodable V1 representation in this group or subjective imagery, which might suggest a specific disruption to pathway involved in the voluntary generation. In visualizers, on the other hand, we did find an association between the conscious experience and the strength of the sensory representation in V1, suggesting that yes, V1 can feed into subjective imagery, but it's nevertheless not sufficient for its experience to arise. And finally, in our Precunious, we found no decoding at all times in aphantasics and above chance level decoding for visualizers in both conditions, possibly suggesting a role of this higher level region as potential correlate of subjective imagery presence. Okay, so to summarize, today I discussed with you about, first of all, challenges in testing aphantasia in terms of demand characteristics arising from direct recruitment and how this can affect responses on subjective scales. And then we talk about behavioral evidence demonstrating preserved performance in tasks that require the automatic generation of sensory representation, which supports a dissociation between the two components. And then another study, which is an fMRI study, in which we found that aphantasics have spared sensory representation without any associated conscious experience, when this was triggered involuntarily, again supporting a dissociation. So to answer the original question that I showed you at the beginning of the talk, Is the conscious experience of imagery always associated with the sensory representation, or can the two be dissociated? The answer is yes, but in the case of my studies, only for this involuntary generation. Okay, so, and now I would like to discuss a bit some potential mechanisms, potential modeling, which I'm still working on, so this is still a sketch, and I look forward to any feedback or discussion on this. So following these results and other results from the field, which suggest that this dissociation between the two components, my proposal is that we should treat conscious imagery as a separate construct from sensory representation. And given that historically imagery has been primarily defined as a conscious experience, I think it makes sense to keep it as a conscious experience. And instead, the sensory representation could be an unconscious representation that is not necessarily unconscious imagery, but rather it's an independent construct that can play many different functions that are not necessarily related to imagery. So in other words, this sense representation is not necessarily related for conscious imagery, but it could nevertheless be a common basic mechanism that is involved in both conscious imagery and other processes, such as attentional templates, expectation, visual working memory. But so the idea is that this sense representation might be still necessary for conscious imagery to emerge. We have seen indeed a relationship in our visualizers group, but it's nevertheless not sufficient. So for it to become conscious, we need to have a higher level representation, potentially implicating precuneus, as our data suggests, or also frontal regions. So in other words, the higher level representation is required for conscious imagery. But the way in which this sensory representation is triggered could also be important. So there could be a voluntary and an automatic pathway, and the voluntary pathway would be involved in voluntary imagery, and it has been suggested and shown that this involved frontal regions, but there could be also an automatic pathway via, for instance, stimuli in other sensory modalities. And the idea is that based on the evidence that I just present to you, it seems that aphantasics can indeed generate this sensory representation when it is triggered automatically. But they cannot do that when they try to generate this representation via the voluntary pathway. And also, so there could be a specific disruption in the pathway involving this voluntary generation. And this also is also suggested by the data by Liu and colleagues, in which they found reduced connectivity between visual regions and frontal regions during imagery generation in this group. But nevertheless, aphantasics can generate this sensory representation when it's triggered automatically, and this could explain why they can still do all these other tasks involving attentional templates and visual working memory. And supporting this, Weber and colleagues have also demonstrated that it is possible to decode the sensory representation of visual working memory in aphantasics primary visual cortex. But the idea is that, as we have seen in the last fMRI study that I present to you, even if aphantasics can generate this sensory representation via this automatic pathway, they nevertheless do not experience any accompanying conscious imagery. So the idea is that this disruption is also present at another step, which is in the formation of this higher order representation that might be required for conscious imagery. And our precuneus results seem to support this idea. So this is the general idea of the model, but of course I'm still working on it and I look forward to any feedback or discussion. So to conclude, I would like to briefly touch on where my work is heading next. So I recently joined Dr. Nadina Stijkstra Imaging Reality Lab at the Department of Imaging Neuroscience at UCL. And here I will actually continue to investigate the voluntary and involuntary imagery, but taking a further step, as I will specifically investigate what is the impact of involuntary imagery on our perceptual reality monitoring. In other words, the guiding question of the project in which I'm involved is the following question: how do cognitive control signal influence our perceptual reality monitoring? Our hypothesis is that due to its lower control over its generation and content, involuntary imagery is more likely to be mistaken for reality than voluntary imagery. And we are currently devising and working on a behavioral paradigm that ideally we then want to translate in neuroimaging using fMRI or MEG to compare voluntary and involuntary imagery and the impact on our sense of reality. And so with this, I would like to thank all of my great collaborators who contributed to the projects that I presented today, but especially Dr. Sophie Foster, who was my amazing primary PhD supervisor and the PI of the Sussex Attention Lab. And of course, I want to thank you all for listening to this point, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Giulia. Let's all unmute and give Giulia a big round of applause.
You are also. Yes.
This was really, really great. Thank you for this amazing talk. So usually for the Q&A, we use the raise hand function. So if you have any questions, please raise your hand via the Zoom button below.